Kavanaugh from the GFOA. I would like to thank everybody on the call here for participating in today's webinar. Reserves, how much can you use? Evaluating organizational risks and reserve levels. So let's get into the slides. This is part of our Fiscal First Aid series. So if you've seen some of the other webinars, you know that we have a 12-step process for financial recovery. And this particular webinar is all about the bridging phase. So we see up at the top that bridging is one of the 3 phases of recovery. So the reserves, or your rainy day fund if you prefer, really provides that sort of cushion that you need to work through some of the financial distress that you're experiencing right now. So we're going to be talking about how much of that reserve is really available to use and how you can be thinking about that as you work your way through the recovery process. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Genevieve Carter, who's going to be taking on the first part of our presentation.
All right, thanks, Shane. Again, my name is Genevieve Carter, and I'll be introducing our panelists and also the rest of the GFOA staff that's on the webinar today. So for our esteemed panelists today, we have a few folks from the field. First, Lunda Osmani, who's the Chief Financial Officer for the town of New Canaan, Connecticut. We have Kathleen Von Aken, the Chief Financial Officer for the Unified Government of Wyandotte County and Kansas City, Kansas. And finally, we have Nancy Zelke, who is a Senior Director at Alvarez and Marshall Public Sector Services. And all of these folks are going to be talking with us today about reserves and risk. We also have several GFOA panelists today. So first is myself, Jen Carter. I'm a senior consultant with the Research and Consulting Center. We have Elizabeth Fu, who's a senior manager, also with the Research and Consulting Center. And then finally, as you already heard, Shane Kavanaugh, who's the senior manager of research at the Research and Consulting Center as well. So just a brief overview today of what we're going to touch on. So first, we're going to talk about why it's important to evaluate risks to reserves and what preliminary steps need to be taken by you and your organization before diving in, in earnest to the process of evaluating risk and determining the appropriate level of reserves for your organization. In order to do that, then, we're going to talk through 3 methods to assessing risk and assessing the amount of reserves that you need. We have sort of method 1, which is more of a basic general fund reserve calculation worksheet, which we'll get into all these methods in detail. We have a method 2, which is more of an intermediate statistical analysis. And then finally, method 3, more of an advanced probabilistic measurement of risk and reserves levels. And then finally, our goal is that you'll be able to take away what you learn today and bring it to your own organization. So we'll talk through key takeaways and ways that you can get started with this process on your own. So we'll first move to considering reserves and analyzing risk. So first, why is this important? As Shane mentioned in his first slide, reserves serve as a critical role to local governments and can serve as a bridge financing mechanism in the case of really any emergency event. Reserves can provide options to you as a government to respond to any number of emergencies and is a very important component of GFOA's fiscal first aid models for cities seeking to respond to and recover from any sort of economic difficulty or risk. Now, while reserves are important, of course, for economic recovery and even thinking about our current landscape with economic uncertainty, it's important to also think about reserves as a hedge against other risks. Certainly there will be economic fallout as a result of COVID-19, but, governments should also be keeping in mind that reserves can mitigate against other unforeseen risks. And we'll talk a lot today about these unforeseen or unknown risks and how to consider those in your reserves analysis at your own government. Now, Nancy, I wanted to turn it to you briefly here to talk about the importance of balancing long and short-term strategy when we think about reserves.
Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Looking at risk is so important for the state and local government as well as school district, finance and budget officer. In fact, the times we're going through right now with COVID, 19, are almost very similar to what we all experienced, back in 2009. If you kind of think about, again, if some of you were even here in 2009, state governments, local governments experienced, loss in property values, loss in corporate income tax, which in many cases had some long-term impacts. Today with COVID, especially with the shutdown of commerce, cities and state governments are experiencing, I call some, more short to moderate term impacts as it relates to loss of sales tax, hotel tax, airport taxes, those revenues that are economic based. So why this session is so important, and why in GFOA's 12-step fiscal aid strategy, this is so important to take a look at risk from both a short and long-term perspective. And I want to say long-term perspective, but from a strategy. Because in using revenues, unless there's an ongoing way you have to replenish those, it's a one-time fix to the overall, revenue stream. So that's why I believe today, looking at these three models, are going to give three options for governments in taking a look at how to address both short-term as well as the long-term strategies, Jen. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Nancy, and completely agree. And perfect segue into our next slide here. So let's talk about the three methods for evaluating risk that we're really going to dive into today. So we're going to talk about three different methods, and it's important to know first off that there's a wide variety of ways to measure risk depending on the goals of your organization, and we're going to talk about three of those methods today. So first, we're going to talk through a very, very basic general fund reserve calculation worksheet. This does not involve any real statistical analysis, but it's going to help you think about the risks posed to your organization in a very structured way. So less statistical, but definitely evaluating risk and plotting out risk for your organization in a methodical way. Method number two is sort of our second step here. So in our AAA framework intermediate step, we're going to talk through more of a mid-level analysis. We refer to it as the AAA framework, and while we'll get into that a little bit later, the AAA framework provides a more simplistic yet quantitative analysis of risk, which often uses historical reference cases as a baseline and creates a range of uncertainty in which to think about risk. And finally, we'll discuss method three, which provides an advanced probabilistic model to measure risk and appropriate reserves levels needed to hedge against those risks. So we're really trying to provide you a spectrum of methods here, anything from the very basic to more of an advanced probabilistic statistical model. And it's really a choose your own adventure, so to speak. Different methods work better for different organizations depending on the level of complexity you desire and what your ultimate goals are. So as you walk through the webinar with us today, keep that in mind and think about your own organization and what you'd like to get out of a risk assessment like this. Okay, so we've made it to our first poll here. So if you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there will be a poll question that pops up there, and if you could please go ahead and answer that. Our first question is, what percentage of your next budget do you anticipate balancing with the use of reserves? A would be none, B is less than 5%, C between 5 and 10%, D between 11 and 15%, and E would be over 15%. And these are really helpful for us to get a sense for, how you're handling this issue at your own government. So we'll take just a moment for folks to answer that. All right. Well, we'll move on to our next poll question here while the results come in. Thanks, everybody, for answering. Second poll question is, we got the results here. Let me share. It looks like the majority of folks on the line here have either less than 5% or between 5 and 10% of their next year's budget devoted to reserves. So that's great. Next question here, how much reserves did your organization have at the beginning of the fiscal year as a percent of your annual revenues? So again, we have A, none, B would be less than 10%, C, between 10 and 15%, D, between 16 and 25, and E, finally, over 25%. So if you all could go ahead and answer that. We'll move on in the slides as folks kind of answer, and hopefully those results will pop up on the right there. All right, so before you get started in this process, regardless of the method that you choose, it's important that you first think about the various risks that could be relevant to your organization. And you can see here on this slide, we've listed, a few risks to consider. And again, beyond economic uncertainties, there are a number of other risks to consider. When we work with local governments, we see a few more common risks listed here, including vulnerability to extreme events or natural disasters, liquidity issues, population growth. This list is from the perspective of more of a general purpose government. So other special districts may have an entirely different set of risks that they're considering. Enterprise funds, for example, may have risks related to things like support from their general government, yearly cash cycles, demand for services. For example, a water utility may be concerned with the condition of aging assets like pipes and water pumps, or may have concerns about changing demand for services. So really this depends on your government, depends on the entity, but you'll have to kind of consider that as well when you're getting started in this process. Now, once you've identified your risks, you have to gather data, and much of this might be internal data, so looking at your historical monthly revenues and expenditures, cash flow data, or other more specific data on natural disaster cleanup and the like. This may also include looking to peer organizations for their historical data, or looking to external sources like FEMA for natural disaster cost data, things like that. It's especially important to consider your revenue sources critically, and I'll pass it off to Lunda here for a moment to discuss why it's so important to think critically about your revenue sources before you embark on this risk analysis journey.
Thank you, Jen. Yes, because each community has a different revenue makeup. When I worked in Kansas, we would refer to it as a three-legged stool, where you have a mix of property taxes, sales tax, and I know some communities have income tax. And therefore, when trying to consider these sources and how each one of those, because each one of those is impacted differently in a crisis like COVID or any other type of disaster. So the first thing you do is to look at your revenue sources and to look at the extent to which they make up your total revenue base. For example, where I am now, the state of Connecticut, municipalities do not get to collect sales tax. There's no municipality with an income tax. We have some fees, but the majority of municipalities depend primarily on property taxes and intergovernmental revenues from the state, depending on the wealth of the state. And I say the wealth of the state because a big chunk of intergovernmental revenues is to support schools. In Connecticut, we don't have county governments, and therefore we don't have county governments. So town governments also funds our school within the school budget, and therefore all of the school revenues from the state are housed with the town and then dispersed to the school. And so understanding how these sources of revenue make up your total revenue source is the first step and an important step to analyze how you to come up with a strategy moving forward. Thank you, Jen.
Great. Thanks so much, Linda. So before we jump into the methods themselves, we have one final poll question for you all. To what extent does your current reserve strategy consider risk? And this may vary broadly with all of our participants. A, does not consider risk at all. B, risk is considered broadly, but we don't evaluate risk. C, risk is evaluated qualitatively. And finally, D, risk is evaluated quantitatively. And hopefully by the end of the webinar today, you'll feel confident moving forward with either C or D, depending on what method you think may suit you. So we'll just take a moment for those responses to come in. All right, I think we can probably end the poll here and hopefully see some results. All right, so it looks like the majority of folks are kind of in this B category. Risk is considered broadly, but not maybe evaluated truly. So again, hopefully today will be helpful for you. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Elizabeth Fu, and she's going to start us off with method number 1.
All right, thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. So the method 1 is really about the general fund reserve calculation worksheet. And I'm going to chat with you a link that has all the resources available for this webinar, including the General Fund Reserve Calculation Worksheet. For some of you, you might have already seen this link and you've been able to poke around and download that worksheet. We'll add more after the webinar as well, as topics might come up and you might want to ask for examples of other things. We'll make sure that we upload it onto that website. Method 1 is really about a quantitative approach. So if you answer C in the previous survey or the previous polling question, this is exactly what we intend to do here with this particular discussion. So if you're able to look at the worksheet, great. If not, I'll be discussing it, and you can certainly follow along. But the worksheet really functions as a diagnostic tool as to how much you can use. I liken it to a wellness check, really, kind of thinking about things more broadly on your physical health. The worksheet asks questions to help kind of identify common risks, general government space. So items that Jen spoke about earlier. And for special purpose government, there might be similar applications on these risks as well. So you can see how it might apply to your situation when we think about how to identify the various risks for your particular instances. For each risk, there are questions to kind of help assess the role that reserves might play, and also any kind of mitigation strategies that your organization has. Considering all these elements, the worksheet prompts users to think about how important the risk might be for your organization, or how important reserves might be for your organization in order to mitigate that risk. So in the worksheet, they'll ask you to identify the level of importance from a category of very important to very unimportant, and this ultimately helps you to identify the target level. So this is the worksheet, and again, if you are able to pull the worksheet from the website or you already have it, I invite you to follow along as I'm discussing. This is really something that I'm going to talk through and walk through, so you could definitely take notes and feel free to kind of consider the elements as I'm discussing. But really what I'm going to do is highlight the potential sources of information and considerations for each of the risks that we will be talking about. That way, after this webinar, if you want to take some time to kind of sit down, go through the different considerations, and walk through the worksheet more carefully, you're able to do so. I will note that for some of you, you might find that these risks do not apply. and that's perfectly fine. In some situations, it doesn't apply. But we were hoping to give you a more comprehensive look and see if we've considered everything that we can. So the first risk that we talk about pertains to extreme events and natural disasters. And a good source of information for this particular risk are subject matter experts, particularly in the public works, planning, or similar operating departments, just to get a broader understanding of events that we might not have necessarily considered. Other useful sources of information include general plans and master plans, just to look at the long-term implications that are might not necessarily be near-term risks, but could potentially still have a possibility in future years. Ways you can kind of assess this risk and kind of draw upon how vulnerable you might be to natural disasters is to understand kind of past experiences, whether it was handled through the budget process, if it was a minor type of event, or did you have to seek things like FEMA reimbursement and the magnitude of the total cost of such events. And then we kind of countered that with mitigation strategies. So your organization might have in place various mitigation strategies to address those natural disasters. In some instances, it might be things like retrofitting and building retaining walls. Or perhaps you might find that the past event might no longer be as applicable because you have your organization has taken on those type of mitigation strategies, so you're less at risk for such natural disaster risk. Another mitigation strategy that governments often have is insurance. So having that capability to be reimbursed through the provider in case of a similar type, in case of an event of a natural disaster. So that rounds up the first type of risk. And we'll move on to something that's probably more, we have a polling question here. So aside from aside from COVID-19, what are your biggest natural disaster risks at this juncture? I'll give you a second or a few seconds to take that. All right, let's take a look at the results to see what you might find. All right, well, while the poll is generating, wow, a lot of flood risk. A good number of flood risk, hurricane risk, some earthquake risk. These are very real risks, and I'll talk a little bit about in the future examples about earthquake and flood for sure, and the potential impact that those things could have. So the next risk I want to talk about is revenue stability. We want to concentrate on the major sources of revenue that are the bulk of the budget. And here we want to look for any kind of changes that might have caused spikes. For example, some revenue streams are tied to seasonality and see some spikes at certain times of the year. In other instances, some revenue streams are more inelastic and are more stable throughout the year. And so what we're trying to concentrate on is ones that kind of ride the wave of economic cycles and how these why these spikes might occur and the fluctuations that they cause. Other things that we might want to explore with these major revenue streams is to see if there's been any changes in customer base that might have caused this, or changes in rates or the tax base as well that might have caused the spikes that we see in these revenues. And then kind of taking it all together, if these spikes happen, either both positive and negative, kind of understanding the magnitude that it has potentially have had based on kind of past experiences as well. And common mitigation strategies that governments have to address these particular expenditure spikes, especially in the negative front, is looking at budgetary reductions as a way to avoid or reduce the need to draw on reserves in order to address this particular risk. And then we're going to turn to another polling question now. In light of the current economic downturn, what revenues are you most concerned about? All right, let's see the results of that poll. Not too surprising, sales tax volatility is number one, followed by property tax and then intergovernmental revenues, with some who identify user fees and charges. That's wonderful. We're going to talk in more depth about sales tax and property tax on this call, and I'll discuss the implications as well as it relates to user fee and charges when we get to that example. All right, moving on to the next risk that we face is expenditure volatility. So if we look at the third tab over, you might find, if you're following on the Excel sheet, you'll find that particular tab. I will say the common examples of expenditure volatility that we see include things like potential lawsuit settlements, as well as things like unfunded state mandates. So it's very helpful to kind of talk to risk management and other operating departments to see what might be coming up in the pipeline in the near term that might warrant a need for a reserve or that we might draw down on expenditures. To kind of assess the potential impact of these expenditures, it might be helpful to draw from either past experiences, if you have past experiences with a lawsuit, or if you are expecting a certain amount that it would cause in order to implement a particular new state mandate or whatever it might be. That would kind of give you a reference point to draw from in terms of assessment. Mitigation strategies for expenditure volatility, as you can imagine, can be a little bit more limited and probably more limited to the insurance and risk pool realm as ways to help kind of offset any use of reserves in order to address this particular risk. The next factors that we find common with local governments is kind of forms of leverage. And any form of leverage could essentially reduce a government's financial flexibility and thus increasing the potential need for reserves to kind of help offset that flexibility. Common ones that we see might include debt, pensions, or OPEB. And in terms of kind of identifying, after identifying these particular types of leverage, you may want to see the implication that it might have on your organization's finances. For example, perhaps the debt level is already high and you're reaching an internal policy cap. Or the example might be that the debt level is going to increase the cost of borrowing, and that cost of borrowing is going to be too great for your financial health. In terms of ways to kind of mitigate this particular type of risk, organizations sometimes have established internal borrowing to help offset some of the need to issue outside debt. Other situations might be, especially related to pension and OPEB, is we've seen governments establish trust and other pre-funding strategies to kind of help to offset this type of leverage. And then if you're following on the Excel, the fifth tab you'll recognize is talking about cash flow and liquidity. So what are the major sources of potential intra-period cash imbalances? Do you maybe perhaps receive major revenue sources only a few times a year, and that requires you to kind of monitor the expenditures to make sure that you have enough cash on hand? And if you do have this particular risk, you might want to assess the potential magnitude of this risk by looking at past experiences. So the level of the imbalance, when did that imbalance happen? What strategies did you take to kind of help address that issue? And kind of thinking about mitigation strategies, one organization we worked with, they were very mindful of cash flow issues because they received the bulk of their revenues at the start of the year. So when it came time to spring and they had a lot of capital projects going on, they would closely monitor these expenses, these major capital expenses, to see when they could start making such purchases in order to make sure that they still had cash on hand to address other payables. And then another risk to a general fund is actually other funds. So when other funds rely on the general fund, you might want to identify what other funds rely on the general fund for an important part of their funding source. So we often see this with enterprise funds. Good examples are golf courses or RV parks, or those are the types that we typically see that might require transfers. In some instances, we see the utilities might require a transfer from the general fund. So after you've identified what other funds are reliant on the general fund, you want to see how likely they will need the general fund for another backstop in the future, or might need to be drawn upon for emergency. So it's really important to see what were the past reasons for why a transfer occurred. Was it actually a general operating subsidy, or was it an actual need for an emergency repair given a situation that had happened? In terms of mitigation strategies for this particular risk, we can see things like internal borrowing, but there's also other elements that could help prevent the need of drawing on reserves. And that would include reviewing charges and fees to make sure that they're in line with what the cost of providing services for that enterprise fund. A couple more risks that we see is, one is population growth. So in the next 3 to 5 years, are you anticipating some type of population growth that would warrant a greater demand in services, but yet you might not but the population base might not necessarily be collecting, may not be collecting taxes on that population base yet. So something to kind of identify if you have anything like a new development that might be coming online that would drive an influx of residents. And to kind of help assess that imbalance, you might want to look to see how many future residents are coming in and the types of residents they might be as well. So certain types of residents might demand greater uses of services, and so that is an important implication as well. And then in terms of a mitigation strategy, governments might look to impact fees, particularly for these types of developments, if there is any concern that that there will be a lag from when services are demanded and when revenues are received. And the final risk we'll talk about is capital projects and capital assets. What we want to really identify and focus on here is if there are any high priority capital projects that don't have a particular funding sources. We're looking at really vulnerable assets and assets that are in state of failure. And to kind of help assess the likelihood of the need for reserves, we look at other areas in which the capital asset could draw from in terms as a funding source. For example, could there be a debt issuance, or is there capital funding strategies that are in place to kind of help with helping to assess the likelihood of this risk? And then in terms of mitigation, it really kind of goes back to the basics and being prudent about the capital maintenance strategies. This includes funding for maintenance and to ensure that the capital asset is preserved through its useful life. So these were 8 different risks that we talked about, and as you were thinking about these potential risks and their implications, we asked you, and the worksheet asked you to think about how important is reserves for these particular risks. So you were asked from the very important to very unimportant, and then it captures some of the summation. And really, again, this is just a general diagnostic tool, just to kind of give you an idea of where you might stand. So if you score between an 8 to a 16, you might have a more minimal risk to consider, versus if you are on the higher end, if you scored 32 to 40, you have higher levels of risk that you're kind of considering. And so with this approach, we're just looking at it from a very high-level perspective and just kind of analytical guidance here as to what you might want to maintain as a cursory overview. And certainly you can do a more deep dive analysis, but this is just a general evaluation of what you could estimate for a reserve level. There are ways to kind of hone in on your preliminary score as well. So factors that might influence this is your government size. So if you're a smaller government, you might have a smaller tax base to draw from, and so that puts you at a higher risk. If you're a larger government with a more diverse revenue profile, then that kind of helps mitigate some of the risk. You might want to also consider other strategies that you might have in place, such as your budget practices, whether you budget any type of contingency throughout the year. You might also consider your borrowing capacity. So what is your debt limit? And if there was a true emergency, would you be able to issue debt to help with a particular risk? We also want to think about our commitments and assignments. So those are the portions of the fund balance that might be already dedicated to other sources that are truly not available versus what might be available. And then we also want to think about outsiders' perception. So how does the rating agency feel about your reserve level? Are you already at high risk, and what are the implications there? You also want to consider it from the outsider's perspective in terms of the public. Holding too much can certainly cause questions as to why aren't there more services, or why are there not lower taxes? And finally, we want to think about the political support as it relates to this particular risk score that you've assigned. Does your governing body have the will and to kind of take on a higher reserve level, or is it kind of getting an assessment of their risk appetite overall? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to offer a commentary over this particular method.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I really like, this model. Prior to joining A&M, I spent about 25 years working in local government, primarily in the state of Kansas as well as Missouri. And when I was practicing within local government, either as a finance director or budget director, these 8, risk factors were the primary areas that I know I worked with my government, my local governing body, to assess where we thought the risk was. For example, when I was with the city of Kansas City, Kansas, we were very prone to floods, especially floods in the early spring and the summer, as well as those tornadoes. So we developed, and in fact, we used this model very specifically in identifying the types of monies that we needed to have reserved for continuing operations. So a couple things that I've seen, and now that I'm doing consulting for local governments, I've kind of taken this model and kind of added a few other factors, which I think I would like to talk about as it relates to how risk should be developed. First area, or the second one that in the model, had to deal with revenue stability. And in addition to take a look at the seasonality, and I agree with Elizabeth 100% that should be taken a look at, I would also encourage members to take a look at the diversity of your revenue base as well. And just like the poll had said, out of 194 people, 81 of you said you're very concerned about the impact of sales tax. So if your sales tax base represents a significant amount of your general fund revenues, the fact that this is a risk. So whether it's 25 or 30%, or even what I've seen in some governments are 40 to 60%. Now that is, a warning sign that you need to be putting dollars aside, to address risk in those areas. Another comment was on the expenditure volatility. And one of the mitigation strategies that Elizabeth talked about was the fact that in the case of a disaster, insurance proceeds or FEMA monies, are going to be available. However, what everyone needs to be realized that the insurance monies or FEMA monies come in after the fact. So you're going to need to have sufficient, working capital reserves in place to fund the, the increased, operating costs, whether it's overtime, whether it's monies for supplies, materials, monies to support repair of bridges, to opening facilities, shuttering facilities, and to have sufficient dollars in place or your capacity to borrow monies in the short term until those proceeds come back. The insurance, is so important, especially the mitigation strategy, especially in areas. In fact, I have some experience with a major hurricane down in the South, and this jurisdiction, in fact, had business interruption insurance. So as facilities were closed, that gave them monies to allow you to they got an insurance policy that allowed for the loss of revenues as relates to major events. But again, that comes in after the fact. And then the last area from the 8 factors I just wanted to talk about is the cash flow, which I think is so important. In fact, the other models kind of address this a little bit more, but from the quantitative model is understanding, the sequencing, the timing of revenues coming in. Property taxes come in twice a year, sales tax revenues, come in once a month. But if all of a sudden, in the case of COVID, we're seeing in many cases, county governments and local governments and state governments are delaying the submission of property tax. Well, understanding what impact that would have to your cash flow is absolutely needed. So if you do not have in place, a 13-week or an annual cash flow statement, that's absolutely needed as you plan. So the first model, I think, has a lot of value, especially for, I want to say, for smaller governments that may not have the staff resources to do the more, qualitative analysis. I think this model can also be used for school districts as well as even large governments. But I think the 8 factors that are presented here are right on as it relates to how we should be looking at our organization.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. Great comments there, and certainly a lot more considerations to be played. I do want to address a question from Josh Iverson. Couldn't slow growth also be a problem if expenses mandates grow faster than revenues, for example? In that particular instances, I would look more closely at per capita analysis. I would also challenge you to think about what are the recurring revenues and recurring expenses to see if it's more of a structural problem. It's kind of a mitigation, or not mitigation, but an analysis there to see if there's any type of imbalances that could warrant more of the budgetary adjustments. So Josh, if that doesn't answer your question, I'm happy to circle back later as well.
So Elizabeth, if I could just comment also on growth, it's not only population growth as it relates to rooftops, it's also growth in your commercial and your industrial base as well. And whether or not your community has the infrastructure in place, to support that added, daytime traffic. That's also an important factor that you need to take into consideration as it relates to measuring risk. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Nancy. All right, let's move on to the fun part. Let's talk more about the AAA approach. So with the AAA approach, it adds the quantitative considerations and adds a little bit more robust elements. But there's 3 things that we must do with this approach. First, we have to accept that uncertainty is inevitable. I think we can all say today that we did not anticipate COVID-19, so we accept that it's inevitable. Second, we must assess the potential impact of uncertainty. Similar with the last approach, kind of looking at past experiences and analogs to kind of give us a reference point. And then finally, we have to augment this uncertainty. So we always say that uncertainty is underestimated. We have some biases internally. We have competence bias as individuals, so we just kind of look things to validate ourselves. So in order to kind of go past that, we augment, and we do so using a rule of thumb that if we have very few data points, we will double that amount as to help it compensate for that uncertainty. So I'm going to go over a story from Southern California government that we worked with there. This happened in 2015, so if you see some reference points to about 2014 or so or older years, this is exactly why. So they wanted to see how much reserves they should maintain given various risks that they face. and then talk about different revenue risk, sales and property tax, two that you guys identified as ones that are really top of mind for you. I'm going to also talk about extreme events, including winter storms / wildfires. It kind of ties into flooding for this particular entity, as well as earthquake risk. And then we're going to circle into the leverage, specifically in talking about how revenue volatility might impact leverage as it relates to pensions. So the first risk that we're going to talk about is the sales tax revenue portion. The portion I'm about to describe can also be considered for the different tax base. So if you just acknowledge that you're interested in fees or charges for services, it kind of follows a similar notion when I discuss the changes in the customer base. So you can kind of apply those strategies there. With working with this particular California city, we looked at 10 years worth of data. We wanted 10 years worth in order to get as much as we can from a historical perspective. Ideally, you might want to look at a broader period to capture maybe 2 business cycles in terms of the Great Recession and then the early 2000 dot-com recession as well. We would like to focus more on the more granular level of information. When we're looking at revenue volatility, it's helpful to look at it from a lower level than an annualized level. This way you can see the different spikes. Here in this particular graph, you see the blue is the quarterly sales tax, and you can see the spikes here. And what we did was we took a trend cycle analysis to help kind of identify and smooth out some of these spikes that you see that are tied more to like back to school shopping and holiday spending shopping. So with the trend cycle, as the name implies, it's intended to show the longer term impacts of the business cycle by smoothing out the seasonal, in this case, the quarterly variances. So the trend cycle is calculated for this particular example using, for example, we're looking at first quarter 2019, or using the average of the 2 quarters prior, and then the following quarter, or the average of essentially third quarter 2018 through second quarter 2019 to get this information. So on this particular graph, you see that the time period of the Great Recession is highlighted in gray for you. We wanted to define that so you can kind of see where the trend cycle is showing the actual impact of the Great Recession started versus what it is actually showing or is actually being experienced through the actual quarterly data. So during the Great Recession, the city sales tax revenue declined quite significantly. And looking at the trend cycle, it declined a little bit earlier in the first quarter of 2007 versus the actual period of the Great Recession starting in December 2007. It also continued much longer. So the red line dipped well past the drop in the blue line. So looking closely at it, we see that the largest, the Great Recession ended in June 2009. And with the trend cycle, you see that it kind of continued through the first quarter of 2010. So taking that into account, what we're seeing is with the trend cycle periods, the amount was actually much more significant in terms of revenue drop than what it was actually experienced if we're looking at just the raw revenue figures. What we also want to recognize is this significant dip during this period, and for this particular particular city, it was a 26% dip over a course of an 18-month period. And we recognize that from a period, if we're looking more on an annualized period, so if we're looking at it from a budget year perspective, it's really those two arrows in green that highlight the most significant change over a course of a year for that particular city. And that change was about 9% of annual revenues. And so that kind of gives us a first preliminary look at what the revenue data is showing us. But we want to look at things a little bit closer and examine the customer base to see how their behaviors might change. Some things are luxuries versus some things are essential. So we want to take a deeper dive when it comes to sales tax data. So in this graph, we broke it down by sales tax category. Again, we look at it from the trend cycle line to kind of remove the seasonal effects. And as you can see, this particular government was really dependent on categories like auto and transportation, business and industry, so the blue and red lines. And what we see with those lines is they haven't recovered by third quarter 2014. They haven't recovered to their pre-recessionary levels. They took a large hit with the Great Recession. Meanwhile, what we see in the green line, the general consumer goods, that grew over this 10-year period. It only had a small dip between third quarter 2007 and about second quarter 2009, but it's very nominal. And then we want to look at the other smaller categories as well, as shown in the bottom. Categories such as building and construction, restaurants and hotels, fuel and service stations, and also food and drugs. So what's noticeable with this category are these categories, particularly for a restaurant and hotels, the purple, we see a decline in decline coming out of the Great Recession, and certainly not quite to the level as it was pre the Great Recession. I'm sorry. It was the buildings and construction categories that was the purple one that experienced that change. There was other categories, so restaurants, hotels, fuel and service stations, and food and drugs that did not experience the declines in the wake of the Great Recession and tend to be generally more stable in nature. Mainly the takeaway from this graph is that over half of the city's sales tax base, auto, transportation, business, and industry, and then the purple one with the building and construction, these are likely to be significantly impacted by another recessionary event, as these items have some more discretion in them, and discretionary spending was tighter during this period. So we wanted to look again a little bit deeper on what this has meant for the city and its experiences. This is when we explored things like the number of establishments in each of these categories before and after the Great Recession. And what we found was that the total number of establishments actually increased in all of these categories except general consumer goods and auto and transportation. So particularly with auto and transportation, that means that there are fewer of the sales tax producers, but fewer establishments could also represent a positive change. It's possible that some of the weaker establishments exit and close during this period, only leaving more of the competitive establishments behind. So perhaps because of that, it could help the city become less vulnerable to a future recession. So in assessing the sales tax uncertainty in a future scenario, We broke it down by each of these categories to see what was, how they were actually impacted during the economic downturn. We used a reference point of the Great Recession and looked at the actual sales tax revenue changes observed during the third quarter of 2007 through third quarter of 2009 to kind of simulate what would happen to each industry during a next economic downturn. We purposely chose not to use a trend cycle for this because the starting and ending point would vary for each category. So to capture the true recessionary effects where the more pronounced slowdowns are in some areas versus others, we opted to use the actual periods for the Great Recession. So the table in this graph, or the chart in this slide, shows the actual changes between the start and end of the Great Recessions as percent changes in revenue received. We then apply these figures to their actual sales tax revenues to see what would the actual impact be overall. And what that represented was a 20.6% revenue decline. And so we augment that information to kind of get a range of possibilities. We consider that we've looked at 10 years of data. So that's a good rule of thumb to start with. So that's a positive. We also considered that the city's establishment base might be less vulnerable to economic dislocations than before the Great Recession. So we also consider that as a positive, and that helped us to reduce our the need for a higher multiplier, and so we apply a multiplier of 1.0 for future revenue volatility. And that kind of helps to augment the potential impact of the potential uncertainty for an impact on sales tax. Switching gears, we're going to look at what is traditionally a more stable revenue source. So property taxes are generally a more stable sources of revenue for local governments. However, there are instances when even these stable sources exhibit some fluctuations. For large revenue sources that might appear stable, we want to assess any potential risks that they might have. I kind of caution, I say, significant revenue sources because they are probably the more critical ones to your overall revenue portfolio, and they will certainly have a larger impact than some of the more smaller sources of revenue. So let's take a look. For this California city, property taxes is comprised of several different things, including delinquent, secured, and unsecured taxes, supplemental property taxes, homeowner exemption, and then real property transfer taxes. As you can see in this graph, there is quite a bit of volatility with the supplemental property taxes side. So what happens is in the state of California, they're required that supplemental changes or supplemental events, such as changes in ownership or sale of a completed new construction, results in a new supplemental tax bill. So the bill is based on the difference between the current value of the property, such as the current sales price, versus its prior assessed value. So in a strong housing market, you can see that 1 year can strongly affect the supplemental tax revenues. And not too surprisingly, it's the years leading up to the Great Recession. So as the graph shows, we see in 2015, 2005, we see a large 1 year spike in the supplemental property taxes. Conversely, if the housing market, when the housing market declined, you see the supplemental property taxes, the green bars, cut nearly in half. What is interesting as you get to the tail end of this chart in the later years, while there was a rise in, while the supplemental taxes certainly did decline, you also saw some offsetting with the increases in the revenues collected for delinquent, secured, and unsecured taxes as well. So kind of taking it all together, some of this impact was kind of the fluctuation we see independently was kind of masked, and overall, the city experienced its largest year-over-year decline during the Great Recession of 2.16% in overall property sales tax revenues. While 2% might seem like a small number, if you place it in relative to the overall revenue portfolio, it can have a massive impact or a noticeable or significant impact. So kind of taking it and applying AAA to the property taxes, we've assessed how the potential property tax decline can affect a government. We used a 2009 example where that was the largest annual negative year-over-year change. In thinking about augmentation, we've looked at 20 years of information, certainly a good wealth of information to explore from. We also consider some changes that have happened coming out of the Great Recession, including stricter regulatory market over housing practices. So recognizing that that is something that has helped with property taxes, we identify a factor of 1.0 for this particular revenue stream. So to kind of augment for uncertainty, we assume a 2.6% annual decrease in total property taxes. Now let's turn to the extreme events example. There are two different types of natural disasters. So there are the types that are more regular events of lower cost, but they just occur at greater frequency intervals. And then there are events that are higher cost events, but are less frequent to happen. So in this particular example, we're really looking at the former, the regular occurrence of low-cost events. And I want to point out a limitation with AAA with regards to natural disasters. It's really hard to factor in the magnitude of these events. So things that could affect how big a fire might be, such as temperature, wind, et cetera, we can't necessarily account for this in the AAA approach. So we have to think about the reference points very closely whenever we're using this method. For this particular city, as you can see, they were experiencing wildfires and winter storms approximately every 2 years. One or another event was happening. So we looked at the events and really kind of broke it down. First, we looked at the population at the time of the event in case there was any type of displacement or growth that was triggered from any outside events. We want to really just capture the event as it was. We also look at the expenditures associated with that event, and certainly the $2,003 need to be adjusted as it's not the same as it is in current day, so we did some inflationary adjustments there. And then we normalized the total cost in current dollars first against the population to gather the expenditure per capita. This helps us to assess the potential range of damages. And you can see there are some lower cost events that had very nominal impact in terms of expenditures per capita, like the February 2005 and the 2010 winter storm. The 2007 fire was probably the most damaging for the city. So recognizing this type of variation, we select a range in terms of identifying the different possibilities for this government. So we took the average of these events, so the $15 per capita as the baseline example, and then we choose the $42, the 2007 event as the upper end. we want to use these proxies to kind of show what it would like to cover more lower incidence events as well as what is in the experience of the city. So in assessing the damages, we apply the AAA to, or we apply the $14 and the $42 per capita to the city's current population at that time, and that gave us an amount of between $718,000 to $2 million, just to show the full effect of what a wildfire or winter storm could have. But the city also recognized that maintaining the full amount might be too much, as the recovery period could extend through future years. And kind of a similar example, it might take a longer time for FEMA to reimburse you, but you might not necessarily need the full amount right away. You might want to concentrate on what you want to spend, what you might need to spend that current year. So using information from their 2007 fire, they found that they spent 87% of their cost of that event in the first year. So we further reduced the $718,000 and $2 million appropriately. And finally, we applied AAA to help augment this particular risk. Here we only have 5 data points and very limited scenarios to draw from. So we only apply the AAA factor of 2.0 to the maximum amount, to that $2 million or the $1.8 million, to kind of and leave the $625,000 to a factor of 1.0, given that past historic experiences, that $625,000 covers most of past experiences. So here we just recommend a reserve in the range of $625,000 to $3.5 million. And then the next type of events that governments could experience with natural disasters are those that are less frequent but more damaging. In this example, we use a blended technique combining both AAA and a probabilistic approach that my colleague Shane Cavanaugh will talk about more. So for this California city, they were fortunate not to have had an experience with an earthquake, but they realized that they were very much at risk for one. They were located along several fault lines, including the well-known San Andreas Fault, and the risk was really real for them. If an earthquake would happen, they had to have reserves to help address any type of cleanup efforts. Since the city didn't have any historic experiences, we did what Jen spoke about earlier in drawing upon reference examples using different sources of information. In particular for this, we looked at FEMA's Public Assistance Database. So it's a public database that provides the total estimated damages from different natural disaster events. As we spoke of before in terms of limitations with AAA, it's really hard to quantitatively include other factors that affect the estimated damages, like the magnitude of the earthquake or where the epicenter might be. But one thing that we can factor for is population density, which is a real factor that affects the damages that a city could experience based on how dense a particular area might be. So first, like floods, we adjusted for inflation. So all these damage figures reflect the current dollars. We then considered the population density using the population during the year in which the event has occurred. From there, we gather information on land area to gather the population density. And finally, we normalized the total estimated damages by this population density, and that's what you see in the last column to the right. The estimated damages per resident per square mile. So as you can see in that last column, the figures vary quite significantly. And so it ranged from anywhere between $3 to $27. Certainly this is not useful information for decision makers, so we make adjustments for this. Based on the damage experienced for each individual municipality, we first apply the city's current population density to see the current impact. We then adjusted it to reflect the amount that it would need in the first year, again, the 87% we talked about with the flood situation. And this gave us an amount ranging from $3,000 in total damages to $2 million in total damages for the first year. Again, this is not very helpful for decision making. And so what we did here, as you can see in this graph, is we turned all these potential first year experience costs and put it into a distribution. So for all the references between $3,000 and $20 million, we create a normal distribution and assume the potential damages take the shape of a bell curve, where the city is more likely to experience a minor earthquake than an extreme event. This is a graph that is depicted in the slide right here, and if you follow on the vertical axis, this represents the percent confidence. On the horizontal axis, you'll see two different figures. The top figure represents the amount needed within the first year in millions of dollars, and then the bottom figure represents the portion of risk covered by that dollar amount, so that confidence figure. In this particular graph, if you're looking at the 3.7 million and the 40% figure on the horizontal axis, what this means is if the city were to reserve $3.7 million, it would be 40% confident it would be able to cover all the first year costs of responding to an earthquake. So in other words, it's 40% likely that the city would be able to cover all first year costs of an earthquake with $3.7 million. What's important to find on this particular type of distribution is to see where the portion of the curve levels off. Once it levels off each increment, or in this case, each additional $1 million, by this less confidence, so meaning more money is being spent to go from 98% confident to 99% confident. So that's why you see in at the tail end of this particular graph, where the chart has two 99.9% figures. That's how nominal each $1 million buys at confident at that tail end. So in this particular example, what we found is before it hits that, where the curve flattens, where the best value in the use of reserves is between the 50 to 80% confidence level, or in this case, between $5.5 and $9.5 million. So at this point, every $1 million in reserves buys the city an additional 4% increase in confidence. So if you're using this type of approach, it's great to show where you'll get the most bang for your buck using reserves, but it also graphically displays the different type of risk considerations and the risk appetite that your decision makers might have. And then switching over to thinking about risk that we should consider more broadly, that might also be impacted during an economic downturn or other risk considerations. We want to focus on, for this particular example, on how leverage could reduce a government's financial flexibility. So with our Southern California city, it has an actuary determined employer contribution rates that were expected to increase over the next 6 years. The steepest annual increase was estimated at 7.6% and costing the city approximately $332,000. While rising pension costs are a recurring event, we certainly do not use reserves because it's not a solution. These are recurring expenses, and reserves are really a one-time source, and so it's not a sustainable solution for rising pension costs. However, there is a scenario where reserves could play an important role if the city's revenues are flattening or declining. So steep increases in pension costs can make it more difficult for the city to reduce its expenditures in face of stagnant or declining revenues. So a reserve could help provide the city with a gradual adjustment to its cost structure without having to abruptly without abrupt cost reductions. For this particular city, it had a pension stabilization fund in place for this purpose. So they were curious to see how much they should maintain in that pension stabilization fund. So applying AAA, we've assessed a scenario where the city has drawn on reserves in the past for a similar reason from its pension stabilization fund when its revenues were flat and declining, and also later declining. We noted that situation. We only have one data point, though. So with one data point, we typically have greater uncertainty, and also greater uncertainty on the magnitude of the scenario that would cause the city to have to draw upon this particular fund. So given that we want uncertainty, we apply a higher multiplier of 2.0, and this results in a reserve of $664,000 in this instance. When using AAA, we've identified all the individual risks, we calculate all the potential individual risks, but summing them up really can mean reserving too much. So how much you really need and how much you really would be required to use. So there are three things that we have to think about. The first is the interdependency of the risk. So risk interdependency means that there is some relationship between the risk factors. So if these two risk factors are highly dependent, generally we recommend generally that means there's a strong likelihood that both will occur at the same time. If two risks are independent, then there's no particular reason why they would occur at the same time. So the last example I talked about, the pension cost, that really illustrates the interdependency. An economic slowdown could certainly result in lower revenues, but it could also result in lower investment returns, which could lead to higher pension contribution rates. Then there are some dependencies also related to extreme events and public safety risks, as well as revenue volatility. A severe natural disaster, a severe earthquake could certainly interrupt consumer spending and the sales tax revenues for this particular city. And then there are also risks that are very independent but for this city we didn't describe, such as lawsuits. Just because a lawsuit happens doesn't necessarily trigger other particular risks to occur. The second thing we want to consider is the probability of the risk occurring. Some risks have a low probability of occurring, but have extremely high consequences if they do occur. And the earthquake example is really a great one. When this happens, there are some risks that are more certain to occur, and the consequences are when there are rather in the opposite situation when there are some risks that are more certain to occur, but the consequences are not necessarily as severe, such as sometimes we have nominal revenue instability that could be very manageable, and you probably had past experiences with that. When these risks are likely to occur, it's wise to kind of consider holding the full amount for these particular risks. When risks have low probability of occurring, It is possible to kind of hold less than the full amount for each particular risk because they are independent of each other. That's to say the odds of both risks occurring at the same time is quite small, so the amount for one might be sufficient for both. And lastly, as we mentioned before, we want to think about the risk mitigation strategies, and in particular with reserves, we think about things like contingency and the ability to reduce expenditures by a certain percentage. Recognizing how much that is can help hone in onto the reserve target. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to turn it to Lunda to offer comments on this particular approach.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was very insightful, and it's an extremely well-defined approach. My comments to this, basically, I begin at the very beginning when you said uncertainty is inevitable, and in fact, that is so true, given my experience here in the town of New Canaan, where I mentioned 98% of our revenues come from property taxes. We don't have any other sales tax or income tax that come at the local level, and this is true for almost all the towns in the state of Connecticut. So we're on a fiscal year. So when we started seeing this downturn, obviously we had received the July distribution of property taxes and the December distribution of property taxes. So in February or March, when the state of emergencies were being declared, we felt fairly immune because for the fiscal year that ends in June, we were in fairly decent shape. We had received 98% of our revenue and we have a fairly high collection rate. And one of the things when you talk about uncertainty is inevitable is initially we did what you talked about. We looked at the 20-year history of property tax receipts and our collection rate of property taxes. That 20-year period covered the 9/11 time frame and also the 08-09 recession. We're about an hour from New York City, and therefore the 9/11 is a good benchmark because this community was heavily impacted by that. But even in those two downturns, we still collected in excess of 99% of property taxes. And therefore, initially, we felt that we were fairly immune from any such type of disaster hitting us. So with that analysis, then we started seeing changes to our original projections. The first thing that came out is at the state level, the governor declared in a series of executive orders, he offered a 90-day deferral of taxes to residents. And therefore, if you consider that cash flow, with us being 98% dependent on property taxes, that meant that the July 1 distribution that we anticipate collecting, that distribution is now going to be delayed for a period of 90 days. We're not going to get that till October. And so then the question began in doing our analyses is, how are we going to look? And so then we started doing, trending our spending patterns and those types of things and see, okay, would we be able to fund our operations in the first 90 days knowing that there's going to be a deferral of property tax revenue? But then even past the 90 days, then we begin to look at, after the 90 days, are people still going to be in a position to make those revenues, to make those payments? And so that uncertainty that change is inevitable began to become real to us, even with that assurity that 98% of our revenues would come from property taxes. So that was something that we had to also start looking at. The other thing is Connecticut is a commuter town, and so we have a number of parking lots at the train station that are town-owned, and citizens pay parking permits to park in those lots. Well, nobody's commuting, nobody's traveling, and so then the discussion became, do we still keep charging these permit fees that are paid on an annual basis for people to park in the commuter lots if they're not commuting to work? And so then the decision was made that we're going to offer 3 months free. Those that had already paid for that period would get a credit. and then any billing that would go out for those parking lots, that would also be defrayed. And so then you see another hit on our revenues as far as fees and services that we charge. Intergovernmental revenue, as I mentioned earlier, towns here also manage funding for schools, and therefore we do get a share of our revenues from the state to fund education. Obviously, the states are also being impacted. The good thing is the CARES Act is attempting to make the states whole. At this time, the state has promised, and as much as a state promise is good, has promised that they will still honor their commitments to public education and to the towns. So we're anticipating receiving those, but that does create that additional aura of uncertainty. And so one of the things that we're now beginning to explore that initially we thought we would never have to go down this route is looking at the potential of tax anticipation notes to basically kind of fill in the gap in the delay of the property taxes. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at. But I do like this approach that you mentioned, Elizabeth, because it does give you the opportunity to do the qualitative analysis, looking at the trends, but it also offers that quantitative piece that I think is truly essential working in this area. So that's kind of where we are in the town of New Canaan, and I just wanted to kind of share those thoughts. But I really do appreciate what you've shared so far. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Linda. This is Shane from GFOA. I'm up next, and I think Elizabeth said that AAA is where the fun starts. So now that we're in part 3, I can only recommend that if you have a standing desk as you are listening to this, it is time to sit down because we're about to talk about probabilistic analysis. So the first part about probabilistic analysis here is the definition of risk is kind of really defined in terms of probabilities. We see the definition of risk is really probability and magnitude of a loss, right? So those are really two essential pieces to risk. So the kind of why we need probabilities then, we say, well, we just heard a lot about magnitude and we've got that, and we didn't really get into probabilities so much. Why are those important, right? And so we've got this little quote here that without numbers, there are no odds and no probabilities. And without odds and probabilities, the only way to deal with the risk is to appeal to the gods and the fates. Without numbers, risk is wholly a matter of the gut. So that begins to speak to why probability is important. And so why don't we just go with the gut then? So I'm going to share with you a little research from the author of Why Risk, or I should say, The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It. Doug Hubbard was kind enough to share some research with us recently on some of the dangers of going with the gut. So number one, we have this little graph here that shows that says when expert performance is tracked, the experts have a much lower chance of being right than they expect. So what we see on the vertical axis is the actual chance of being correct, and then on the horizontal axis is the assessed chance of being correct. So the experts rating their own answers on how their probability on being correct. So for instance, on the horizontal axis or all the way over to the right, you will see 100%. So that means that if I were taking a quiz or something like that and I said, oh, I've totally got this, I have a 100% chance of being right on this question. And then you compare that to how often I am actually right over on the vertical axis, you can see it ends up being about 75% of the time. So that is a big difference. And it's very different from that dotted line that says ideal calibration, where 100% intersects with 100%, because if you're calibrated, if you think that you have a 100% chance of being correct, you should actually have a 100% chance of being correct. But as we can see, there's a big gap between those two lines where the average answer of the uncalibrated expert is very different from the ideal calibration. So that's kind of quantitative proof that experts are often overconfident in their ability to assess uncertain figures. Next point here is experts are inconsistent, so they're influenced by random and irrelevant factors. So they have difficulty replicating their own judgments. And so what we've got here is the two estimates. So if I'm the expert and I'm being asked to give two estimates and I say, well, first time my answer is going to be 0.4. Well, the second time it should also be 0.4 if you're asking me the same question. But what this graph is showing us is that the dots are not intersecting on that line that goes down the middle, right? Because the line that goes down the middle, we're looking at 0.4. The line goes through 0.4 for the first estimate, goes through it for the second estimate. So if experts were perfectly consistent, we'd expect all those red dots to be on the black diagonal line. But as you can see, they are not. And that tells us that folks are a bit inconsistent in making judgments over time. And this kind of next little slide gets a little into why that is. And so what we see here is that decision makers are sometimes inconsistent for a number of reasons, especially when it comes to risk and regarding their own aversion to risk. So here's just a few factors that research has shown to have a significant influence on people's risk aversion. So being around smiling people reduces your risk aversion. So I think you'll want to be very cognizant of that when you're presenting this analysis to the council. Recalling an event that causes fear causes your risk aversion to go up. Recalling an event that causes anger makes you more willing to take risk. A recent win in an unrelated decision causes your risk aversion to go down, and a recent loss in an unrelated decision causes your risk aversion to go up. So all those are either non-objective sort of things that cause people to have different calculations of risk when they're using just their gut. So kind of the point here is that a quantitative method, perhaps like Elizabeth showed, is a great way to move away from pure gut decision making. And just to mention that, just to reinforce that we have the report from Colorado Springs that I think is a nice complement to what Elizabeth showed. You can get that on the website for this course, which will remind you of where that is at the end of our presentation. But you can start to, you can use that report from Colorado Springs to walk through what some of Elizabeth showed, and we'll also have some of the Excel examples that Elizabeth showed as part of that information. So the slide shows some examples of governments that have benefited from probabilistic analysis, and I won't read all these, but we'll just focus on that first one. And the Douglas County, where it says it provides an amount that can be justified and still have the flexibility in times of economic uncertainty. And I think that really gets to the essence of what a probabilistic and more quantitative approach to risk analysis can do for you. So for the rest of my time, what I would like to accomplish is to walk through just a few decision-making tools. So we aren't going to be able to teach a whole probabilistic method to make you quantitative experts on how to do this, but I can teach a few decision tools to help you incorporate this into how you go about assessing risk. So first is normal distribution, also known as a bell curve. And the idea being is that a lot of natural phenomena fall in natural or normal distribution. So the height of American men, for example, are normally distributed, where 5'9" is the most common height. But then you also have these other heights. You've got the gentleman from Game of Thrones. You've got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I think he's actually over 7 feet. But the point being is those guys are at the end of the distribution because their height is relatively rare. And what this has to do with risk in local government is a lot of risks that local government face are often on a normal distribution. So let's take rainfall, for example. You've got a normal rain season is most common, but you then also have perhaps very heavy rain season and drought. And both those things could have unexpected costs or revenue losses for your local government, right? For example, if you have a water utility, right? And so the point of this slide is that the tails of these distributions is where the risk is at. So when you're thinking about risk, you want to be thinking about your tail events, right? So what are these kind of more extreme circumstances that we need to be aware of and thinking about when we're planning out our reserves? And as we're kind of thinking about, well, how much can we use today? We want to be thinking about, well, what are these other risks that we're subject to, and what kind of tail risk is there that we need to be prepared for beyond what we're dealing with related to the COVID-19 downturn. So let me just show you how this would be applied in real life. This is a distribution for snowfall from a county government, and what we see there is that the average snowfall, the most common snowfall, is 54 inches. That is the top of the distribution. And if they budgeted for removing 54 inches of snow per year, this county would have a coin flip chance of having a budget deficit, right? Because it's right in the middle. That means you have 50% of the time it will be more than 54, 50% of the time it will be less than 54. This county had intuited over time that they shouldn't budget at 54. They should budget somewhere to the right. They didn't have this kind of distribution, but they just kind of figured it out. So we did this quantitatively for them, and they said, okay, this is where we're budgeting. We're budgeting for a little bit more than 54. That's where that green box is, but that still leaves everything to the right of the green box as a possible risk, because they could have more snowfall than that point of the green box will cover. So the reserve strategy had to be cognizant of that. So, for example, if they had enough reserves to cover up to 84 inches of snow per year, they would be able to cover about 95% of possible snow seasons. If they went for the 78 mark, that would give them enough for about 90% of possible snow seasons. And that is the reserves then are the difference between their budget at where the green box is and either the 78 or 84-inch line, wherever they choose to put their reserves up to. But the point being is that the probabilistic analysis gives them the ability to say, here's our budget, here is what is beyond our budget, and it also tells them what level of confidence they could have with a given amount of reserves. You can also take a probabilistic analysis like this and flip it into a different type of presentation here. And this is a cumulative probability chart. And what this one is showing us is that you've got this is for floods, and this takes a whole series of floods, just very much like Elizabeth showed with her earthquake example earlier. If you remember, she said there was that hybrid approach. This is kind of going beyond that and taking it full probabilistic, but it's only one step further, so it's pretty close to what Elizabeth showed. You could definitely get here from what Elizabeth did. And what it's showing is it's putting all the floods that this city could be subject to using reference cases like Elizabeth showed into this array. And it tells us that a number of about $527,000 will give us 90% confidence of being able to cover a flood in the city. And what's interesting about this is you see that if you want to go to the right, like, well, 90% confidence doesn't sound like a lot of confidence. I'd rather 95%. You're going to have to spend a lot more money to get there, right? You're going to have to spend about $1.2 million or have about $1.2 million in your reserve to be 90% confidence. But if you said 85% confidence sounds okay, you can see on that graph that you'd have to spend about $350 million to be 85% confident. So that is not a linear difference between the 90% confidence level, the 85% confidence level, and the 95th confidence level. So there's a point at which you get diminishing returns from putting these reserves aside. So something to think about as you're developing your own reserve strategy is where do you get the most bang for the buck from putting reserves aside. And kind of, I think maybe the most important decision tool here for our talk here today out of my presentation is this next one, where risks aren't additive. And what we've got here are two risks, simple ones, hazardous material spill and a wildfire. And we have different confidence levels along the left-hand side, 90%, 95%, 99%. So let's say we wanted to be 90% confident of covering the loss from a given hazardous material spill. We would need $3.1 million. We'd also need $2.5 million to be 90% confident from covering a given wildfire cost. If you add those two things together, you get 5.6. However, you don't actually add them together like that, because if you want to be confident of 90% confident of covering the loss from both wildfire and a hazardous material spill, that's a different story, because you're very unlikely to get a very bad hazardous material spill and a very bad wildfire at the same time. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you here on the next slide, how that works. So in the giveaways for this course, we have a little model we've designed for you special, and you can download that on the website that I'll show you. And this little reserve calculator kind of walks you through how this works. And so how it works is you've got in the upper right-hand corner, the level of confidence that you want to have from the different risks that we just put in here, hypothetical risks. So I want to be 95% confident that I can cover the damage from an earthquake, 95% confident that I can cover the damage from a flood, and so on and so forth. And what it shows at the bottom is when you add all these things up, that means across all these different risks, you're actually going to be 99.8% confident in total, and it's going to cost you $267 million in reserve to get there, right? So I say, oh, that's, pretty interesting. I was only hoping for 95, but I'm actually getting 99.8. And this is really the power of diversification at work, again, because it's very unlikely you're going to have all these events occur at the same time, much less have like the worst possible outcome for all those events at once. So if we said, well, because we only wanted 95% confidence and we're actually getting 99.8. What if we settled for lower confidence on the individual risk, knowing that that will aggregate up to a lower confidence on the all risk put together? So on the next slide, we do that. And what we found is that in order to get to 95% confidence in aggregate, you only need 82% confidence on each individual risk, and then look at the total amount of reserves necessary to get there. You've got 168 versus 267. So it's a very big difference. Understanding this kind of power of diversification is a very powerful concept that I think will help you think through your risks a lot more strategically, knowing that when you're reserving for all these different risks, it's a different story than when you're looking at them individually. So this is an instance where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, or maybe in this case. But the point being is that being aware of the role of diversification in your risk analysis is very critical. And this model, again, can be downloaded from the course website, and I'll show you where to get that in just a minute. GFOA.org/FFA, but downloadable. I'd encourage you to play with this. So some of the resources that you can use to get started with this is we have the webinar from the March 27th. If you haven't seen it, there's some other tools on there for probabilistic thinking. There's the demo that I just mentioned, the reserve calculator demo, so you can start playing around with that to get a sense of probabilistic analysis. You can also get other probabilistic models at probabilitymanagement.org, which is a group we work with to build these things. You can also actually download a free set of tools from them to start building these models if you want on your own. And then we also have the Newport Beach risk model. You may have seen this in a prior webinar, but we've also got that available so you can play with that one. That is a more advanced one if you want to get a sense of what probabilistic analysis looks like. And also I'll mention Probability Management is actually creating a whole webinar series about how to use their tools. So we're trying to cooperate with them to have more resources to be able to have you do these on your own if that is something that interests you. So with that, we are going to hit the takeaways. And I think, Kathleen, you had some things you wanted to jump in, but I'll just kind of go through here real quick on my takeaways, and Kathleen, you jump right on. Is number one, the importance of garnering community elected support and financial policies. So I think Kathleen had something to say about that. But I'll say about the last two is be risk aware. Is any of the three evaluated methods that we've talked about can help. It will help you kind of structure the decision-making process to avoid some of those problems of overconfidence that I showed earlier from Doug Hubbard. And if possible, take a quantitative approach if you can, model 2 or 3. And the reason you want to do that is there's something called you just need to outrun the bear, beat the bear fallacy, and it goes like this. Two men were walking through the forest, and they come across a sign that says, "Danger, bears in the woods." And one guy puts his running shoes on, and the other guy's like, "Oh, you can't outrun a bear. Why are you putting your running shoes on?" He said, "Well, I don't need to outrun the bear. I just need to outrun you." And that's the essence of a quantitative model. Quantitative model does not have to be perfect. It just has to be better than the alternative, which might be gut decision making. So you need to beat gut decision making with your model. It does not have to be down to the kind of last decimal point perfection. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Kathleen to give us some of her thoughts on the takeaways from part 3 and overall.
Thanks, Shane. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Well, so I applied the unified government assumptions to the probabilistic approach or model, and I learned that we have some exposure to be concerned about because our current reserve basically has 2 months of operating reserves, and that just covers, your liquidity issues and any kind of unexpected changes in your revenue estimates, frankly. But so this model, what it does is it incorporates mathematically the likelihood of multiple types of disasters occurring throughout a 10-year time frame. And it's flexible enough that you could, for example, I'm from Kansas City, Kansas, and we have a Kansas theme today. So we do generally have disasters. So you can have a tornado, a normal tornado go through your my county, and but you could also incorporate the probability that there would be a much larger tornado that would actually go through the 1 mile square area where 50% of your retail activity takes place. And so last year I warned the commission that if a tornado destroyed our Legends Outlet Super Bowl, then the impact would be significant on our revenue base and operations. You know, and some of the commissioners were very skeptical that that would occur. Granted, there is a low likelihood of it occurring, considering that our county is 156 square miles, but, you know, so that makes it basically 1 in 156 chance that that might happen for a Category 3 or 5 tornado to hit that mall. But sure enough, you know, 6 months later, a tornado hit, you know, went through that facility, and it only missed the mall by half a mile. So, you know, you really do need to have your money set aside in case things like that happen. So, you know, I think we're all living through that right now with the COVID. We didn't think that there would be a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, but here we are. I did want to talk a little bit about the importance of garnering elected official support, as well as your executive, who you work for, your city manager or county administrator. So, because, you know, all the models are certainly great, but you still need to garner that support. Obviously, utilizing data-driven and statistical modeling to support your view for the appropriate reserve is an essential piece of your argument for raising your reserve levels. But all the modeling you can do back at your desk won't matter if the executive team and the governing body keep spending at a level that doesn't allow for the reserves to grow. So your city and your county manager and the elected officials, they rankle with a lot of myriad of demands and pressures to deliver a variety of services at different levels. And all of these pressures cost money. Obviously, adopting prudent financial practices by growing your reserves competes with these demands and pressures. And so you have to sell it. If you're going to have a positive impact on the strategic financial future of the organization, you must lead. No one else will. It's up to you. You have to persuade them that all the myriad of pressures are a lower priority than their mutual interest in ensuring the organization as a whole can live through a catastrophic event without implementing employee layoffs or reducing our services. So our unified government, it's a city and a county combined. We require that all our employees live within the county boundaries. So if we were to institute a layoff on a portion of our total 2,300 FTE, it would have a negative impact on our region's economy. And so furloughing a portion of our employee base would be counterproductive, and it would depress housing and retail activity. So, you know, 2 years ago, I was fortunate enough to secure adoption of a revision to our Unified Government General Fund Reserve Policy. So we increased the minimum from 10% to 3 months of expenditures. And what did it take for me to get this, to secure this? Well, it took a full year of a lot of meetings. We had 2 meetings with the county administrator and his executive team, 5 presentations before the elected member Economic Development Committee, Economic Development and Finance Committee. I had one-on-one meetings with each of those 5 committee members, then 2 more presentations to the whole commission, one-on-one meetings with the remaining commission members that weren't on the committee, and then after only everyone saw how important it was and understood the terminology and the provisions, they all agree or internalize actually why it was a priority. So now when we review the budgets, they always talk about this month of operations reserve, and it's now their goal, not just finances. So it's very important.
All right. Thank you for that, Kathleen. Definitely appreciate it. And so just to wrap things up, we did promise these resources, so we also have a poll question I should mention. So Dan, if you could pop up our last poll question, we'll just do that. And while you guys are thinking about that, I'm going to go ahead and get into the conclusion. So at the end is we've got all the resources that we talked about here at gfoa.org/FFA. So that's the models, the Colorado Springs report, all sorts of things. So check out that website. And for a little more kind of specific guidance on where exactly to look, you will see the April 30th training, How Much Can You Use Evaluating Organizational Risk and Reserve. Click that link and you will find all sorts of stuff that was talked about on this webinar right there. So go visit that to get everything. If you have questions, we can go ahead and get those into the chat feature. So our panelists are happy to stick around and answer questions. And if you have email or things you want to send over email, you've got everybody's email right there. So with that, I know we did have one question that I saw that we can go ahead and address right off the bat. And then General Elizabeth, if you see others coming in, we can address those as well. But one question that I saw was about the 16.6% that was referenced earlier, and that where that comes from. And so that comes from the GFOA best practice, which calls for governments to hold a minimum of 2 months. So if you divide 2 by 12, you get 1/6, which equals 16.666. The question in the council, that sounds like an awfully specific number, 16.6. That's why it seems like a very specific number. It's just 2 divided by 12. But really, I think the takeaway for this webinar is that the best practice in that recommendation of 2 months or 16.6% is a great rule of thumb to have if you don't have other information on the risks that you face. But hopefully with the tools that we've described here on this webinar, you're able to better refine your risk profile and come up with a level of reserves that is the best fit for your community.
Shane, there was one additional question from Camille Hooper, and the question was, for the probabilistic models like Newport Beach's analysis, where did the raw data of events and dollar impacts come from?
Fantastic question. It was actually very similar to what Elizabeth showed. So if you were following along with Elizabeth, you are much of the way there for probabilistic analysis in terms of getting that data. So for the natural disasters, very similar to what Elizabeth showed. We're looking at reference cases from what happened at either within that government. So our ideal source of data is what happened to your government. But in many cases, local governments are fortunate enough to not have a lot of direct experience with the sort of things the risks are subject to, earthquakes being the leading example. So you don't, thankfully, not too many earthquakes have occurred in most towns, but yet you might have a real earthquake risk. So you want to look at the damages that have occurred to other towns and use those as an analog. And those are the starting point for building these probabilistic distributions. You can also use staff estimates. So for example, Newport Beach wildfire was a risk. They are in the situation where they didn't have like any actual wildfires that have occurred in Newport Beach within, I think, the last 30 years, if I recall. So there's not a lot of historical data. Also, their kind of topography is very distinct from other areas in California. So just looking at wildfires in other communities was not a great idea because the differences were significant. So we worked with their fire department to estimate the risks. And I think this is a great point if people are interested in doing this. If you're working with your staff to estimate risk, remember this slide. That one. So the slide here that shows this overconfidence and the kind of assessed chance of being correct versus the actual chance of being correct. When you are having people estimate things like maybe what's the potential damage from a wildfire, folks will generally be overconfident in their ability to answer it. So the kind of rule of thumb you can use, an easy rule of thumb, is take a range that you get and double it. And the double the range will give you something that will be closer to what a statistical analysis would give you. And we've actually tested this out when we've worked with local governments where we have gathered data from the staff and then compared it to what the numbers tell us, and the numbers suggest, yeah, you should double the range from the staff and you'd be close. And this does not mean like the staff are bad or anything. That just means they're human, and it just folks are generally consistent in the fact that they're too narrow in the ranges they develop. So having this rule of thumb handy can make kind of human-generated ranges much more useful, because we just know they tend to be too narrow. So you double them or widen those ranges significantly, and you get an answer that is going to be much closer to what you need for a kind of more accurate analysis. All right. Any other questions? We're firmly in the bonus time, so happy to keep going if there's others.
Yes, I did not see any additional questions submitted here.
All right, very good. All right, well, I would like to thank everybody for sticking with us for the bonus time. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next webinar, and feel free to get in touch if you have questions or comments or anything like that.